Beneath the remote island of Dawn, far north of Mariel, lies the ruins of one of the most isolated civilizations on Dremel, Xor'huul, home of the Xorhei. This clan of outcast Dremari thrived beneath the Isle of Dawn for almost 600 years before a tragic series of events brought about their end. This is the Primordial Archive, and in this video we will discuss the lore of Xor'huul and Drehmal Apotheosis. Part 1. Origins of the Xorhei. To understand the origins of these people, we must go back to the early Second Avim, just after the end of the Deity War. While various primitive tribes and clans roamed the world of Dremel, one of the first real civilizations to develop was in the far northwestern region of Kasai. Prime conditions for farmland around the northern and eastern edges of the Kasane Peninsula allowed the Kasane tribes to advance socially and technologically much faster than their southern neighbors around Mount Ebenfire and their eastern neighbors in Mariel. Soon, tribes began to coalesce into societies with complex systems of government. One of the most influential figures in the unification of Kasai was a fearsome warrior from the Xorhei tribe, which inhabited southern Kasai, named Xorhei. He rapidly obtained a position of power in his tribe and began an increasingly intense campaign of negotiation, blockade, skirmish, and even outright war, all in the name of unifying the loose tribes of Kasai into a single, powerful empire. Xorhei's campaign was effective enough that by around the year AV2 1189, less than 200 years after the end of the Deity War, his newborn empire was able to establish a capital city, Athra, on the northern shores of Lake Athra. Only a handful of northern tribes still resisted being absorbed into Xorhei's expanding empire. However, Xorhei, unsatisfied with even his dominion over the vast majority of Kasai, went to war once again with these remaining tribes. By AV2 1255, every tribe had fallen, either by assimilation or by genocide, except one, Clan Xorhei, a co-worshipping tribe of far northern Kasai. Undeterred, Xorhei rode to war against Clan Xorhei the very next year. That was his final mistake. While his army won the war, firmly establishing the Kasane Empire, Xorhei found himself perished on the battlefield at the hands of the Xorhei clan. Furious, the newly crowned Kasane Emperor Zahad Alna chained every member of the defeated Clan Xorhei to the masts of a fleet of ships and set them adrift in the northern ocean of glass. While this was obviously intended as a genocidal act, it happened by chance that after days at sea, the Xorhei washed up on the island of Dawn, known to them as Duzel, starving and injured, but mostly alive. The survivors declared themselves the Xorhei, in honor of their ancestors and those who had died at sea. However, their troubles were not over yet, as their new home would have its own difficulties. Part 2. Early Days of Xor'huul. From the beginning, survival on the Isle of Dawn posed a major challenge. First of all, the flora and fauna were incredibly different from those on Xorhei's homeland in northern Kasai. Luckily, the Xorhei were uniquely equipped to deal with these challenges. As a devout, co-worshipping tribe, they made their home in the region's caves, since underground the differences from their homeland were not so apparent. They built their settlement, which they named Xor'huul, in the caves, and were able to subsist mostly off of food and supplies available underground. However, life in the caves came with its own problems. The Xorhei rapidly discovered that the Mindarum crystals found above ground were also present and in greater number below the ground. Since these crystals were nigh impossible to dig through, they adapted their settlements to the crystals, carving tunnels and rooms around them while leaving them in their places. During the construction, however, they found the greatest danger yet. The crystals were jealously guarded by a species of magic crystal pests, which they called the Vorthra. While small, these deadly beasts put a complete stop to the construction while the Xorhei debated how to deal with them. In the end, the Xorhei priests of Ko came up with a ghastly but effective solution: ritual sacrifice. As one Xorhei writer puts it, the Vorthra permit us to continue living in the lands below and harnessing the magic that the crystals bear in exchange for sacrifices of our own to their many teeth. It is not a noble act, but from the beginning, the Xorhei have been driven by necessity and survival. These sacrifices were effective in gaining the favor of the Vorthra, allowing the Xorhei to finish building their settlement, and thus truly began the history of Xor'huul. Part 3. Life in Xor'huul. Despite the fact that Xor'huul thrived for almost 600 years, very little is known about most of its history. What little we can tell about their day-to-day life comes from a detailed analysis of the ruins they left behind. The ruins of Xor'huul are based entirely around one central room surrounding the largest of the Mindarum crystals. From this room, 6 different passages branch out. The first passage to the south leads to the one and only exit to the surface. The next passage to the east leads to a hub for mining in the ore-rich caverns below Xor'huul. This was likely the primary trade of most of the working class of Xor'huul, as evidenced by the prevalence of mining and smelting equipment throughout. The third passage, also to the east, splits in 2 clearly divided sections. One leads to the living and working quarters of the working class. These rooms are mostly dilapidated and poorly supplied, with what little food there is being mostly rotten scraps, and sections being worn down or even caved in entirely. Separated by a short hallway is the northern section, which was the quarters of the upper class. In sharp contrast to the lower class's space, these rooms are nearly spotless even in ruin, with nicely maintained and polished surfaces and no sections caved in. In addition, these quarters are well stocked with everything from food to weapons to even magical and alchemical supplies. In the very north of this sector lies the throne room, with the king's undecorated but imposing throne and the royal bedroom. Moving counterclockwise, the fourth passage, branching off from the central room, leads to a stairwell straight down to the lowest part of Xor'huul, the sacrificial pit where the sacrifices to the Vorthra were performed. The fifth passage leads to the west, to the library of Xor'huul, containing the historical and magical knowledge of their clan. And the sixth and final passage leads down a long, twisting, natural cave dotted with Mindarum crystals to the communal church of Ko, and the rooms of Ko's priests. Last but not least, throughout the central room in all 6 sections, a complex, sprawling ventilation-like system allows free passage of innumerable hordes of the Vorthra, whom the Xorhei believe to be sacred to Ko. From these ruins, it is clear that as small as Xor'huul was, the Xorhei had a quite complex society with decently advanced technology and a very strict caste-like system of class divisions between the nobles, the priests, and the commoners. While most of their lives were spent underground in the caves, once they had firmly established a society in Xor'huul, they also began to explore above ground, as evidenced by the construction of many small structures, perhaps acting as waypoints for navigation above ground on Duzel. This continued for several hundred years, as Xor'huul grew ever stronger and yet became ever more set in its ways. Eventually, however, around the end of AV2, they discovered something that would rapidly come to spell their doom. They were not alone on the Twin Islands. Part 4. The Fall of Xor'huul. During the entire history of Xor'huul, on the other twin isle to the west, the Coven of Ko was quietly continuing to exist. Compared to Xor'huul, very little information is known about the Coven. Their origins, customs, and the vast majority of their history is completely unknown. Like the Xorhei, they are known to be worshippers of Ko. Their mythology centers around the Star of Annihilus, which they describe as a brutally jagged rock from elsewhere that glittered green and gold, and the legendary pickaxe, the Star Piercer, which shattered it. The Xorhei became aware of the existence of the Coven as their influence above ground grew, and they sent a priest to investigate and negotiate. The priest did not succeed in establishing positive relations with the Coven, as he was angered by the Coven's refusal to acknowledge the sacredness of the Vorthra. However, he did succeed in stealing a tome of forbidden knowledge from the libraries of the Coven. As he says in his diary, the tome spoke about an order of the devout who were once ascended by Ko, and only Ko. They were not Termari, but something else, a people of stone scales and gemstone eyes. Driven by this knowledge and his own hubris, he and the other priests began to develop an unholy ritual to ascend themselves to Komari, without the assistance or even the approval of Wise Worm Ko himself. After almost a year, the twisted work was completed, an unholy ritual of stone, capable of the creation of Komari. Filled with confidence in their work, the priests performed the ritual upon themselves first, and were met with success. They had become Komari, with scales of stone and crystalline eyes. Elated with their success, they even performed the ritual on King Xuthro himself. However, this success was short-lived. The ritual of ascension turned out to have long-term consequences, as those who had the ritual performed began to develop a mysterious illness, characterized by a cough that develops into a debilitating weakness, and eventually the unfathomably agonizing complete crystallization of the sufferer. Worse still, this illness turned out to be contagious, spreading like a plague among the priests, and even infected some of the nobles on whom the ritual had not been performed. This caused a panic among the nobles. Despite the gravely ill King Zuthro's orders to the contrary, some even began hoarding food and supplies and barricaded their quarters off from the common spaces. Within a couple of days, the commoners were running gravely low on food, and tensions heightened enough that one working-class Xorhei named Arzo began to organize a rebellion against the nobles. On the 4th of Tazgan Roma, 1821, AV31 in the Avsamic calendar, Arzo's band of commoners stormed the barricades with their crude weaponry and attempted to seize control. Despite the mismatch in equipment, they won the day, although Arzo himself was slain during the battle, and seized the nobles' storerooms. However, although they won, they had made a grave mistake, as by entering the nobles' quarters, they had exposed themselves to the deadly plague brought about by the unholy ritual. Despite their ceaseless prayers to Ko to save them, within days nothing was left alive in Xor'huul, save the ever-present swarms of the Vorthra, feasting on the crystallized flesh of the fallen. Long after this tragedy, only one question remains. Why? Part 5. Why? What caused the ritual of the Xorhei priests to go wrong? Especially when, at first, it seems like they were so successful. Their sudden collective turn for the worse seems inexplicable. First off, unlike the previous sections, which were based almost entirely around lorebooks and around Xor'huul, this section is much more speculative, as this question is not directly addressed in any lorebooks. We can only piece together an idea from outside sources. Importantly, all other ascended people in Drehmal are ascended directly by the aspects or the deities. Virmari are ascended directly by Virtuo, likewise Milmari by Male. Termari are ascended by the Prismatic Council of Aspects. The priests of Xorhei wish to become Komari, beings ascended by Ko and Ko alone, rather than the entire Prismatic Council. While ascension into the Coven of specific aspects was common in the first Avim, after the formation of the Prismatic Council, it became forbidden. Thus, Ko would not have approved of this plan, meaning the Xorhei priests were left to try and accomplish it on their own. However, therein lies the danger. Aspects or deities are typically necessary for ascension, so we can assume that the process requires the usage of divine energy, which is energy filtered from Kai's Numen core, a tremendous store of primal energy beneath Lodar. Without an aspect to wield primal energy in its more benign form as divine energy, the priests of Ko had to have used pure, unfiltered primal energy to accomplish their unholy ritual. However, primal energy has negative effects on the Drehmari body, as we learn through Avsam's experiments with primal Kaisbrew in the Foundry. While nothing happens for a couple days or so, after some time, negative effects such as searing headaches, foaming of the mouth, and antler shedding begin to manifest. In particular, one symptom Avsamic officials noted in particularly advanced cases was the crystallization of the blood in the skin of exposed individuals, which corresponds perfectly with the description of the dead in Xor'huul. Thus, we can assume that the underlying cause of the plague that manifests in Xor'huul after the unholy ritual was exposure to unsafe levels of primal energy, resulting in advanced cases of the entirety of the population terminating in total crystallization of the afflicted. So, thanks for watching the Primordial Archive, and let us know in the comments what other lore topics you'd like us to cover. Me and Russell. We have a bit of a backlog of ideas, but if you guys really want to cover specific parts of the lore, we'd really like to hear that. So we're not just covering some obscure stuff that y'all might not really care about. So thanks again. Later.